Twat, Askene, Wagachnedi, Gene Githridi, Sne Wagachnedi, Gene, Nyathwit, Chanlagi Anthe, Jutnege di Sosete, Skaroreh Katenuaka di Wakfnune. Hello, my name is Chandler Allred. I am a member of the Beaver Clan. I'm also a member of the Skaroreh Katenuaka Nation of North Carolina. Today we want to give you a quick rundown of Tuscarora history. I think we're going to do this in two parts. And I also want to specify that I speak only on what I've been taught and my knowledge. So if what I say goes against what you know, what you've learned, I apologize. I can only speak what I know, what I've read, and what I've been taught. So to get started, I'd like to start with our creation. I won't go into full detail, but I believe that the only way to really understand Tuscarora people, our native people in general, is to know where we believe we came from, or where we know we came from. So in our creation story, there is a woman named Sky Woman who fell from the sky world above us. And down here, back before there was any life, there was no soil, no dirt, no mud, nothing like that, no earth. There was just water here, a bunch of water creatures in it. She fell, and kind of summarize the story, she was caught, kept in safety by the animals that were there. They helped her land onto a turtle's back, where she helped create Iniufne, the earth. And so a little bit later on, there was two twins born, the good twin and the bad twin, or the right twin, the left twin, however you refer to them as. These two twins were known for creating everything else. The trees, the water, all this, the animals were made by the good twin. However, his twin brother, the bad twin, as people refer to him as, came back and put a current in the river so it could be dangerous. He put, where there's good animals and kind, gentle animals, he also put evil beast animals. He also created the thorns in the woods, the poison, such like that. There was a big fight between them, and the good twin came out on top. And then he helped create the people, the Egwahentwe, the people. When he made the Tuscarora people in our stories, he always had a very fondness to us. There's a fish that jumped over there. But when he created us, he had a fondness to us. And us, along with the Haudenosaunee up north, we're all one people. Then there were some splits, some wars, and it was taught to us that the good mind helped lead us Tuscarora people down here to North Carolina. There's different parts throughout that story. There's the grapevine story where there was a river, but larger than this, where the people were split because they were crossing with a grapevine across, and the grapevine broke. And the people that got across the river had to continue on. And those were the Tuscarora ancestors. They found this land. They called it the Cypress Islands, or Katenuaka. They found this land, and they decided, and the good mind decided that this would be our home. And the good mind had to depart from us. He had to leave because he needed to go back up north to help the other nations of the Haudenosaunee. But he wanted to keep us safe, so he guided the thunders, the thunder beings, to protect us. And that's why, if you're in North Carolina, you know us for our storms and our hurricanes and such like that. Again, I don't want to talk about it too long because we'll be here for so long, but during this time of us getting here, there's a lot of fighting. There was different creatures that would attack us, and we'd have to call upon the thunders to help, and call upon the good mind to help. So with us being in North Carolina, the South Carolina and Virginia areas today, we had allies and we had enemies. Our most notorious enemies, I refer to them as the 3 C's, the Cherokee, the Creek, and the Catawba. With us being the furthest Iroquois people, we were bound to have these enemies to come against us, with them being from different people, different language groups. Except for the Cherokee, they are an Iroquois people, but live more of a southeastern native lifestyle, like the Creek and the Catawba. And we also had allies. Along with Tuscarora, there was the Nottoway, who's now what we refer to in the Virginia area. Then below them was the Meherrin, and then there's us. And down here, there's a wampum belt that we have where it's a cypress tree. And there's two different versions where it's a tree, and then the other one's a tree too. However, what alternates is in one version, the Nottoway are told to be the hawk on the top of the tree that watches for enemies and such. The Maharan are supposed to be the middle part of the tree. They are the messengers between us. And then the Tuscarora at the bottom, we're the roots, we're the system. We are what gives the tree the life that it has. We formed our own, what some people refer to as the Southeastern Alliance or the Southeastern Iroquois Confederacy. Along with us, we also had allies, some Algonquin people on the coast who worked in a tributary sense with us and such. And then there's also a group called the Wakan, who are a Siouan people. However, we refer to them as our little brother, and they lived in our lands, and we protected them, and they protected us. So, with our creations and then us being here and it being established, I also want to mention that with the Tuscarora people, like many people, our lands were expansive and such that there was different regions. We call them the lower towns and the upper towns. And the lower towns, the upper towns, they were all Tuscarora people. However, as we're going to talk about the history today, there was differences between them and how they were affected by colonization and such. So talking about colonization, Tuscarora people were some of the first native people to witness Europeans, the first being the Spanish that came up from Florida and settled here for a few years until we kicked them out. And they never came back, and they went all the way back down to Florida, and that's the farthest up to us that they would get. Then we also experienced other English settlers coming in. There's a story here in North Carolina that's pretty famous. There's even a play that's written about it, and our Tuscarora traditions and our truth is different from what others believe. But there's the Roanoke colony, or commonly referred to as a lost colony. They were one of the first established settlements here, with a few others that came before them. And in our traditions and our stories, and even if you can find it, you can find old colonial records, like John Lawson, who was a surveyor for North Carolina, speaking on Tuscarora people, saying that the lost colony wasn't lost. We took them in, because after the founder had to go back overseas and get more equipment and food and rations, he couldn't come back for years. And during this time, in our stories, there was a fishing trip of Tuscarora people that were attacked by these people. And so we conducted a mourning war, not like day and night, not like mourning, like in the morning, but mourning, as in we're crying, we're sad because our people were killed. So we went to them and enacted revenge or justice, but we didn't kill everyone. We took many of them back to be adopted into us. And like I was stating, John Lawson writes, and others write, how we said that a few generations back we had ancestors that spoke in book. And what that means is that they wrote, like English people, they wrote down, because we didn't have a written language here. We communicated orally our history. There's also the Ralph Lane expedition, where he was trying to go into the interior of North Carolina, and he very quickly was chased back to the coast by Tuscarora people. And so a lot of these early contacts with Tuscarora people were not the best, especially in the lower towns. There's a lot of fighting. There's traditions of our people being kidnapped. There's traditions of our people being murdered. And so we did what we had to do. We fought back, and we pushed them back to the coast. And because of this, the English people, they begged us to, the European people, they begged us for a peace, that for a war and conflict they started. They begged us for peace, and we made several wampum belts during this time that basically, in a general, was saying, don't come at us anymore. Don't try to attack us anymore. We want to be friends. We want to be neighbors. You know, we don't want this conflict. And so those were made. However, those didn't last, of course, as we're here today in a colonized society. So to talk about Tuscarora people and to talk about what's coming, the Tuscarora War, as people refer to it as, or as many Tuscarora people refer to it as, the Big War, because like I said, there's many conflicts before this war. There's many conflicts after. But coming to that, there's cultural issues and disconnect between Tuscarora people and North Carolina settlers. We had a different religion, a different way of living, where European styles are very nuclear family. You own your land, and you control what's there. With Tuscarora people and Native people in general, we had a communal understanding of ownership of land and of our things. We lived in a very we lived in a society where we depended on one another, where English people lived in a society where you depend on yourself. So there was all these issues between us. There's the cultural issues of that. There's a difference in how we farmed. Where European farmers used domesticated animals and large tracts of land and such, where we used our own backs. Our women farmed, where European men were the ones to farm. And our men would farm too from time to time and get involved too. But farming was known to be a very sacred thing, connecting the women back to the earth, and the whole understanding of giving new life, like only women can do. And so the farming was done by many of the women, where Europeans, it would be the one man in the family doing all the farming, and maybe if he had sons, they would do the farming too. Our religions, like I said, our religions were different. We believed in many, what you might refer to as deities. Europeans believed in one. They believed in one God. We believed in many. Like I said earlier, there's a sky woman. There's the good mind, the bad mind. There's many more that I cannot talk about, because we'll be here for a long time. And also, I believe that some of these things should be kept for Tuscarora people. Along with more cultural misunderstandings, we were known to be slash and burn farmers, where we would burn a large tract of the forest so that it could grow back, or burn a large tract of land so it could grow back. And European people didn't like that very much. We also had a different understanding of community and acceptance of others, where John Lawson wrote that we were so kind to European people. When they would come to our villages, they would have a place to sleep, a place to eat, where when we would go into these European settlements, we were shunned out, we were attacked, we were accused of robbery, of theft, when we would want to eat from their garden or eat from their food like they were welcome to do with us. So there's all these disconnects. There's also the issue of encroachment. I keep referring to a man as John Lawson. As I said, he is a surveyor for North Carolina, works with the Lord's proprietors and such, and he would help map out where new settlements can be made. And he lived among the Tuscarora people for a while, but he was never really our friend. Even though many of us thought he was our friend, he was never really our friend. And he would lie and say, like this whole tract of land over here is open for settlement. But then these European people would arrive there, and there'd be a whole Tuscarora village there waiting, or Tuscarora allied villages there waiting, living and having settled there for generations. One special case is a man named Christopher de Graffenried. He was commissioned to take a bunch of refugees from England, and he brought them to North Carolina after buying the land from John Lawson. Then he also had to pay the Lord's proprietors. And when they arrived here, after much difficulty, which I recommend anybody reading about his journey and his trip, when they arrived to the land that was supposed to be theirs, there's a whole Tuscarora village sitting there. And so then he had to pay the Tuscaroras. And again, this village, this chief, this headman, was very, very generous and wanted friendship, and agreed to move his village over a few miles to give the European people space to live, especially after their journey that Christopher de Graffenried talked about. So this encroachment, this disconnect in cultures. Then there was a huge issue for our people, which was the Indian slave trade. When many people think about slavery, they think of African slavery, and that's coming in history. But slavery took many steps before then. First, there was the indentured servitude of European people, where they were supposed to serve a set number of years to clear a debt that they had, and then afterwards were supposed to be able to live, with a certain tract of land and such. And in a lot of cases for them, they were never able to leave that, because a lot of these people couldn't read, they couldn't write, so their owners, the people they were indebted to, would change the contracts for them. Well, see, the other issue with that is European people come from a very cold, rainy climate. In North Carolina, it's very humid. It's very humid, and it's very, very different from their climate. It's very swampy here in North Carolina. All this land used to be a big swamp until it was drained and changed for people to live here, European people to live here. So they had these European people, these indentured servants, passing and dying from the climate, from the diseases and such. So the next best option was, well, African slaves or African people, if we want them to be slaves, they're all the way in Africa. That'll take a lot of money to get them here, a lot of things. But there's native people just a few miles down the road from here. We can enslave them. And so this brings up the gun debt slave cycle, as I was taught. So first, native people wanted, like I said, we had many hostilities with our neighbors, like the 3 C's I mentioned, the Creek, Catawba, and the Cherokee. And that was the same for them. They had a lot of enemies. They had to maintain a sense of strength. So when muskets, when firearms got here, that really leveled the playing field for a lot of people, where some of these nations that were smaller and constantly being picked on and attacked by these larger nations could make a debt by purchasing these firearms and being able to use them in conflict and settle scores. However, the issue with that is they were always indebted. They always had to pay it back, and this was done because the European people that gave them these firearms, these North Carolina settlers or other settlers, this was not just North Carolina, up and down the colonies, knew that these native people couldn't pay them back. So that's where the debt comes in. And to clear your debt, they said, well, if you go out there and bring us back like 20 or so people from, wherever someone you have an enemies would, bring them back here so we can make them slaves, we will clear your debt. But it's called a cycle because even after these people would go out and get native people and bring them back to be slaves, they would need new guns eventually. They would need ammo and such. So they'll be in debt again, have to go get more slaves and such. And this was a huge problem for Tuscarora people. With us being so far down amongst these enemy neighbors of ours, we were constantly having to suffer from being captured and such. And almost every nation participated in this. Even some Tuscarora people participated in this trade, which is very sad. But then I'll also mention that European slavery and native unfreedom was different. Some people call it slavery. Or for like us Tuscarora people, you might be indebted or work for a while, but usually you would be adopted. Usually when we capture people, you would either be executed for to clear a family's mourning, or you would be adopted by that family and take the place of the person that you killed or your people killed. And so this form of enslavement that they referred to us as having is different than the chattel slavery for Europeans, where you just work, you're never free, and then you'll die as a slave. However, unfortunately, this is what happened. Many Tuscarora people were enslaved. But then there was another issue that came with this, and it was that native people knew the land. So if my village is like 20 miles inland and you got me here on the coast working, when you're not looking, I could just take off running and I can get back to my village, in the next day. So Europeans were like, okay, well, what about this? We're going to take these native captives that are now slaves. We're going to take them to Charleston, which is a huge port in South Carolina, which is right below Tuscarora territory, and we're going to ship them out to the Caribbean to make money and such. And what's very sad about that is the mortality rate of enslaved people that went to the Caribbean was very high because the sugarcane plantations that they would work on required a lot of work. It was very, very different climate there. There's a lot of different diseases. Similar to how Europeans came here and were dying in indentured servitude, our people were dying in the Caribbean from the mistreatment and such. And also, we were free people. We're not used to being captive. And so that weighs on you, and it can break your heart, and then you can become ill and die. So all of this culminates to the encroachment, the disconnected cultures, and the Indian slavery. All of this culminates into the war. And it all starts when John Lawson, the surveyor, and Christopher de Graffenreid and their 2 slaves and some Indian scouts of theirs decide to go down the river. John Lawson wants to find more land to be able to sail and such. And Christopher de Graffenreid and his slave go with John Lawson, his slave, and his Indian scouts. And they went down the river like this. And they were going down it for such a long time, and they were coming up to a village. And this is where I want to break away from this real quick and describe something. In the lower towns, there is one central chief that's understood, or headman, was Chief Hancock, or sometimes referred to as by the English as King Hancock, because they believed he was the king of the Tuscarora and lower town Indians. And similar to him, in the upper towns, there is a man named Chief Tom Blunt, or Chief Blunt, or King Blunt. And similar to him, he was known to have the largest voice in these other nations up in the upper towns. So, I also like to mention here that Tuscarora chiefs and such weren't just men. There's also a lot of women chiefs noted in history. And just like talking about Tuscarora culture itself again, there's not a strict gender basis on your roles and such. It was written that many Tuscarora men would stay back in the villages when other men would go hunting and such, and they would stay back to defend the village, but also to do what was called women's work by people like John Lawson and others who witnessed it, because they would help in the gardens, they would help the women make things and such like that. And there's also women that they participated in warfare. So going back to where I was, John Lawson and Christopher de Graffenreid were going by Chief Hancock's village, and they were met with some Tuscarora messengers that said, hey, you know, we want to speak to you, we want to see you, and we want you to turn back down the river, stop going inland towards more of our territory, turn back. And so of course they said, yes, we will. So the messengers went back to the village, and John Lawson, Christopher de Graffenreid, and their 2 slaves decided to continue down the river, because John Lawson told Christopher de Graffenreid that, you know, there's a place that they can camp. However, by the time they got there, there was a good number of Tuscarora warriors waiting for them. They sprung on them, took John Lawson, Christopher de Graffenreid, and their 2 slaves, and marched them all the way from there, all the way back to King Hancock's village, where they would be awaited trial. So the Tuscarora people know John Lawson. They also know that he's the one that's causing all this encroachment, all these issues for us. So they decided to put him on trial with Christopher de Graffenreid and their 2 slaves. Also, like to mention here is we didn't see slaves, English African slaves, as different than Europeans, because we believed that they were in one group together. Later in history, there is going to be issues with African slavery and even Native people owning slaves. But in the beginning, you'll see a lot of records of slaves being killed just alongside their European masters, because we clicked them into one group as outsiders. Then there's also a lot of African slaves that were freed and taken back to our villages and became members of us, which is I'll talk about one specifically in the next video. But so John Lawson, Christopher de Graffenreid, and their 2 slaves were going through trial, and Chief Hancock called upon the Council of the Great, and after a few days of debating it, going back and forth, and even John Lawson, when they were going to be freed, John Lawson got into an argument with a man named Skaroreh Tom, and was telling him that when they get back, they're going to bring the militia and they're going to exterminate the Chief Hancock's village and such. And so they said, okay, well, if you're threatening war, then all right, let's go back. Let's have another reconvenience of the Council of the Great. And so in this last council, they were sending out word to all the upper towns too. They wanted them to participate. Everybody a part of this Tuscarora Confederacy needed to have an input. Well, Chief Blunt, King Blunt, was asked. He didn't come, but he sent a message. And his message was, kill John Lawson, free Christopher de Graffenreid. So it was determined that John Lawson and his slave will be executed, and Christopher de Graffenreid and his slave will be freed. So there's different versions on how John Lawson was executed. The most common, and what I was always taught, was there's a type of wood called fat lighter. It's from a decaying pine tree and such that's fallen in the woods and has settled and such. And the people would cut it up into splinters, and it's a really good fire starter, and it'll hold and stay on fire for a very long time. So the story goes that they filled his body with these fat lighter sticks, and they lit him on fire, and so he burned for a very long time. And different versions on how they killed John Lawson's African servant, his slave. Again, it's very sad that they killed him with John Lawson, but you also have to give a historical context to that, again, as they viewed them as the same. And so different versions were that they just slit his throat, others were that he had the same fate as John Lawson. But I want to end this version here, because after this, we're going to talk about the war, the reservation period, and Tuscarora today. So I hope you enjoyed it. I want to say Nyawe, and see you on the next one. Esketge.